This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair, OMFIF. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from my government career to discuss where U.S.-China relations stand now and where they may head under a Biden administration. Ambassador Tong is a partner and member of the Executive Committee of the Asia Group. He leads the group's work on East Asia regional issues. He worked for 30 years in the State Department. He was a leading architect of the TPP, U.S.-Korea trade agreements. He played a pivotal role on APEC. He served in China and Korea. He headed up the NSC Asia section. He was deputy chief of mission in Japan. So as you can see, one of our foremost Asia experts. Wendy Cutler is vice president at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the managing director of the Washington office. She had a 3-decade-long career as a diplomat and negotiator in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as the acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. She's worked on bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations, including with Korea, TPP, U.S.-China talks, WTO financial services negotiations. There's nothing in the world of trade she hasn't done. And Bob Donor was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia at the U.S. Treasury for a decade, Mr. Asia, as we called him, and he was the chief economist at for Treasury's International Affairs Department as well. He was Treasury's attaché in Tokyo for many years, another Asia expert. So apart from the outstanding qualities of today's panelists, what makes this discussion more special is that they came from different agencies, state, USTR, and Treasury, which have different perspectives, but often need to work together, and all three know each other well from their careers. So I plan to lead our panelists in a general discussion, and I hope we'll turn then to audience questions, and they can be submitted via the chat function. So let's dig in. China has become the world's second largest economy and a power in its own right. There's a narrative in DC that Obama treated China benignly and Trump was tough. That is a caricature in my view, and I felt Obama was much tougher in his second term, which coincided with President Xi's rise and growing authoritarianism, though he certainly wasn't as vociferous as Trump. Of course, China under Trump was seen as a geostrategic competitor. That's a shared view across the US political spectrum. The word decoupling was in the air. It seemed as if the US-China relationship was perceived as zero-sum. There was much tension. So let's dig in and try and explore in a first round what you, given your backgrounds, believe Trump got right or wrong. So let me lead off with Kurt, given your role at Asia Group and as a former State Department officer. Could you kick us off with some points from a broader geostrategic perspective? What do you think Trump got right and wrong?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for including me today. I think that one of when people compare Trump to Obama or Trump to Biden, but particularly Trump to Obama, they're making the assumption that it's the US that is the only element that can change in the equation of US-China relations. And in fact, in the late Obama administration and then into the Trump administration, it was the Chinese side that was changing policy most dramatically in becoming more confrontational toward the West, more authoritarian internally, and more aggressive regionally. And that, I think, resulted in a change in the thought processes of really most of the national security community in Washington and in the United States, coalescing around this idea that the relationship with China had shifted to one that could best be described as strategic competition. And that has become a consensus view, really, across parties in the national security crowd and certainly within the Biden administration. What the criticism of the Biden people, and I share this, is that the Trump team got the analysis right. And if you look at their national security strategy, it captured fairly much consensus agreed upon elements of what is concerning about China from the US perspective, but that the actions taken were politically driven and meant to gather attention and look tough rather than necessarily be tough. And so you ended up with this blunderbuss approach of the first half of the Trump administration concentrating almost solely on negotiating trade agreements, and then the second half of the administration, President Trump telling his national security team, well, just do whatever you want, get out, again, a blunderbuss, and just fire it away and see where those things fire. And so I think the Biden team will try to be more precise, and choose issues that matter in the competition with China, and be, if necessary, confrontational on those. And so I think we'll see a combination of confrontation on some issues, outright cooperation on some, if it's possible. China likes to link things, the cooperation, to then reduced confrontation on other issues. And if China does that, the cooperation might not develop. But I think we could see that. And then a lot of negotiation on some of the difficult issues in between. And the other characteristic, I think, key characteristic of the Biden team will be that they're going to very much put more effort into coordination with allies. That's not going to necessarily be easy. You don't just say, hey, let's all do this together, and it happens. The agenda setting is extraordinarily complex, and then coming up with the right alignments, the right trade-offs, and agreement on what is not on the table in terms of trying to, in a sense, shave off the negative implications of China's rise without questioning its rise. But doing that in a coordinated fashion across friends and allies, it will be very complicated.
Well, great. Well, thank you for that. And we'll come back to where Biden should head. But that was a wonderful depiction of the current state of relations. So Wendy, in Washington, the narrative is China cheats on trade, forcing firms to transfer their technological know-how, excessively subsidizing firms through industrial policy and state capitalism, stealing intellectual property. It's perceived as a threat to us on the technological front. We see that with Huawei and TikTok. Trump's response, as Kurt was just alluding to, was rhetoric, tariffs, phase one deal, entity lists, and the like. So what's your take on what he got right and wrong, and where we are right now before we, in the next round, plunge into where Biden should go?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to be with Mark, Kurt, and Bob. I mean, I have to say, when we worked on these issues for many, many years, we didn't always see eye to eye. And we were involved in some pretty tense interagency meetings. But I will say, whenever I went overseas, I always felt that we spoke as one. And that's so important. And I really look forward to kind of that return of just deliberate policy making when all views are held, but they're not broadcasted on Twitter. They're real thorough and very educated and tough policy coordination. But then again, we go overseas, we're one government with one position. So I really valued our collegiality. I think Kurt got it right in terms of, where Obama left off and where Trump picked up. China changed. And Kurt, you mentioned, they became more assertive regionally, more authoritarian domestically, but also they really stalled on their reform and opening agenda. With the possible exception of financial services, which I know you guys care a lot about. But if you put that market aside, we really saw reform stall in many, many other sectors as the state got more and more involved in the economy. So what did Trump get right? I think Kurt really touched on most of the issues. I'd add just a few. I mean, not only did he bring China front and center on the agenda, but he also put a bright light, and here I give Ambassador Lighthizer a lot of credit, on a lot of the structural and really unfair practices that China was following, whether it be on IPR or on technology transfer, on excessive subsidies that will create enormous overcapacity globally, as well as other practices. And the other final observation, and I put this somewhere in got the right category, is he was really willing to take on the business community when it came to China. Because one of my frustrations, and I'm not alone at USTR through the years working on China, was that our companies were pretty conflicted. On one hand, they liked the access they were getting, the market that they were serving, and the money they were making. They wanted us to be quote unquote tough with China, but they also didn't want to be part of the get tough strategy. They wanted it both ways. And as a result, I think our hands were tied in a way that all of those cords were cut in the Trump administration. But let's be honest, he got a lot wrong. I mean, frankly, it was a unilateral approach. I think there was severe miscalculation at the beginning. I think the Trump team, based on their earlier days with Japan, and this is where, particularly with respect to Ambassador Lighthizer, I think he felt we're going to threaten tariffs. We'll threaten a lot of tariffs, and then China will come to the table and make concessions in all of these areas. And they weren't prepared for counter retaliation. And if you had a real policy process, I think people like her on this call would say, well, we should get ready for counter retaliation. And so, as we all know, this spiraled into retaliation affecting hundreds of billions of dollars of imports and exports that are still in place today. Second, he really alienated, not only did he not work with allies and partners on the China strategy, but he alienated them through other measures, whether it be steel and aluminum tariffs, discussion of the level of forces and who's paying for them, et cetera. And third, he didn't stay the course. So while he put all these really important issues on the agenda, at the end of the day, he settled for a subpar agreement, the phase one agreement, which really put off the issues of subsidies, state-owned enterprises, cyber theft, and even the areas of technology transfer and IPR, which were addressed in the phase one agreement. The administration admitted there was more work to be done in these areas. And I would just then conclude with one other observation where I think he got it wrong, and that is the whole negotiating style of the Trump administration. It was done in public, a lot on Twitter, and I think that just puts both sides in boxes and makes it harder to find common ground. The priorities were shifting all the time. One day it was the trade deficit, the next day was the structural issues, then it was the purchasing commitments. And as a result, I think the negotiation wasn't focused enough on what was really important and what needed to be solved in order to reach a deal. And I would just conclude and say a lot of it was very top down, coming from the president, even with the president kind of discrediting his own negotiators at times. And we all know if you're going to be effective overseas as a representative of the US government, the other side needs to know that you have the mandate, you have the credibility, and what you agree to, you can bring home. And frankly, he undermined a lot of his negotiators, including at the cabinet level.
Thank you for that. Yes, he didn't make much progress on the structural issues. The deficit with China went down, but the overall US deficit has gone up. And when you try and negotiate with the gun to the Chinese head, they don't budge at all. Bob, Treasury worked well with the People's Bank and the Finance Ministry over the years. A lot of common interests on global financial stability, sound economies. They need to work together in the G20, the IMF, the FSB. The currency policy problems had waned by the time Trump took over. China's external surplus was small. But as Wendy said, Trump focused on bilateral bounces. CFIUS and financial sanctions, which Treasury oversees, became a far more prominent issue. Trump wouldn't engage. There were concerns about Chinese debt trap diplomacy. So from the standpoint of a former Treasury official, what do you think he got right and wrong?
Well, thanks, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here with people I've worked with and respected for, gosh, a couple decades. First, I think Treasury did have a more cordial relationship with the Ministry of Finance and the People's Bank of China, partly because there was a large overlap of common interests on economic recovery and financial stability after the global financial crisis, but also because what we were calling for was in many cases what those agencies were arguing for internally. But they weren't patsies, and neither were we, and were areas where our interests diverged. Official export credits, rules for exchange rate policy, international debt workout. It was really a hard slog. We talk a little bit about what Trump got right and got wrong. First, what he got right was identified China as a strategic competitor and as a threat in several areas. That was coming, but it was a clear and decisive shift. Second, I'll disagree with you, Mark, here, because I think the Chinese do respond to a direct threat to their interest. And the Trump administration was willing to marshal the leverage of the US government, primarily through tariffs, in a way that we'd never been able to do before. That opened up opportunities that hadn't existed before. And finally, as Wendy mentioned, the USTR 301 report really set out the issues that mattered in the US-China economic relations. Chinese industrial policy, but also Chinese technology acquisition policy. Unfortunately, the administration squandered the opportunity that they created. They settled for a big transaction deal rather than dealing with the structural issues. It's sort of debatable in retrospect, but I think there was an opportunity in early 2020 to deal with the structural issues the 301 report identified. Second, they never developed off-ramps for the tariffs that they imposed. So that both reduced the leverage, basically eliminated the we'll take these away if you do this, but it also left the United States and China with vastly increased bilateral tariffs on each other, creating an encumbered trade area between the two. And finally, the Trump administration swung too far on the adversary approach to China and gave up the ability to shape Chinese behavior. Saw this in the approach to Huawei. It became a jihad. It was never clear whether it was a national security issue or an attempt to drive the company out of business. And it convinced China to double down on their industrial policy and technology acquisition policy, the very things that we were objecting to. Let me talk a little bit in my own lane about Treasury issues, and that's the foreign exchange report. Foreign exchange report was always an unloaded gun. It was always more intimidating when we were waving it around than it was if we actually used it. The Trump administration unfortunately turned the foreign exchange report into a farce. When they named China in August 2019 as a currency manipulator for no real reason, and then unnamed them 6 months later in January 2020 when they announced the phase one deal. People ask me about the foreign exchange report, will Treasury designate particular countries? And my response is often, who cares? So I view the Trump administration as a decisive change in US policy, a huge opportunity that was squandered, and also a hardening of positions on both sides that's very difficult to reverse and creates a difficult situation for the Biden administration.
Well, thank you for that. So let's look forward. I hear all of you saying that China changed on the heels of Obama's growing concerns. Trump amped up the concerns to the hilt, but that he correctly identified China as a growing strategic challenge to the world. But at the same time, he was belligerent. He didn't pragmatically lend the administration to effective dialogue, and he didn't find solutions. So with that inheritance, then the questions are, what lessons can the Biden team draw and where should it head? And I'd like to do this in 2 rounds, maybe start with substance and then have a quick round on process if I can artificially divide the two. Kurt, you began to talk about the bigger picture of where Biden needs to go. But can we see it as a strategic competitor, take a tough line and yet work with them? And to what extent does the fact that the US has damaged its global brand in recent years impact Biden's approach?
Those are both great questions. I think that looking at the substance of the matter, on the highest priorities would be technology, the military balance in the Western Pacific, and all the questions around good governance and democracy and human rights. All of which are essentially confrontation issues as opposed to cooperation issues. So on the technology front, I think the US objective will be to try and maintain a lead in certain core technologies, which are important for future economic growth, but also important for maintaining a military advantage. And we're all familiar with these semiconductors, quantum computing technology, artificial intelligence applications, the robotics, materials, et cetera. That would be number one. Number two, maintaining military balance requires switching out equipment to a significant degree in the US military's forward presence, making it more mobile, less manned, more unmanned, harder to hit, and faster in hitting back. And that will require a lot of investment and close cooperation with Japan, with Taiwan, with Korea, Australia, and others. And on the democracy front, I think the goal is no longer to try really to change China, because the corollary of China as a strategic competitor that does not accept the appeal to shared responsibility or being a responsible stakeholder in the global system, et cetera, that it has in fact decided to be an authoritarian state and will remain that way. Then it's a question of making sure that the discussion around governance is sufficiently pointed that it influences the thinking in other countries, but doesn't get you trapped into trying to raise expectations that somehow you're going to be able to change how China governs itself. So those, I think, are really key elements. There's going to be a whole range of policies that come out in support of each of those. They're all confrontational. You mentioned cooperation aspects. There are things which the US and China could cooperate on. The coronavirus response being one of them. They both sides dropped the ball on that in 2020, but there is more to do still going forward in terms of getting the rest of the planet vaccinated. North Korea is an obvious cooperation point, nuclear proliferation, weapons proliferation in general, and climate change. But I don't think that the Biden administration, at least as Joe Biden intends, is going to see any trade-offs between the confrontation issues and the cooperation ones. And rather, these are in China's interests, and they will cooperate with the United States and with other countries if they see it as in their interest and they act in their interest. So they drown and starve and get dried up just as much as the rest of us due to climate change. So do we need to negotiate climate change targets with China? Why do we need to negotiate that? They should set their own targets and we should set our targets, and then when they don't do enough, we criticize them. That's the negotiation. So we don't really need to be happy together as we do this. We can just talk about it. And I think that's true in a lot of these so-called cooperation areas. And I think that's actually kind of how it's going to play out.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Wendy, trade and technology in general, and what's going to happen to tariffs and 301 tariffs? And many think they're going to stay on for a while, and it won't be easy for Biden to climb down. Will there be talks which actually get at structural issues such as industrial policy, and can China deliver? And given your Asia Society hat, I'd really like to know your views on getting back into TPP, what to make of RCEP, and I read recently that you've suggested that sectoral deals could be a TPP alternative.
Okay, that's a lot. So just some reactions. In some ways, the tariffs that have been left for Biden, he's inherited, it's about tariffs on about $370 billion worth of Chinese imports into the United States. In some ways, they could be important leverage. But I would also argue, I think people have gotten the Chinese and others have kind of gotten used to those tariffs. They seem predictable and there's certainty around them. No one's looking to increase those tariffs. So I wonder if that leverage may be overestimated as people have gotten used to them. That said, I think that if the Biden administration can get China to move on some key issues, these tariffs could, in theory, be lifted. I don't think they need to be lifted all at once. You can do it tranche by tranche. You can reduce the rates. Most of the tariffs are at the rate of 25%. So there's a lot to play with there. But I will say Congress is going to be watching very closely in terms of what the Biden team does with tariffs, what they do with the export controls they inherited, what they do with the sanctions they inherited, trying to pounce on Biden and his team if there's any whiff of weakness. And I think that became apparent during some of the hearings of some of the senior cabinet appointees of the Biden administration. So I don't expect the tariffs to be lifted anytime soon, but I would hope that over time we could find ways to work with China to address some really pressing issues and maybe lift them, step by step. One thing I think the Biden administration can do, and with respect to tariffs, is really improve the process for seeking exclusions to these tariffs. And in this manner, I think you can put forward a process that's more transparent, more predictable. When you get an exclusion, it stays for longer. And also an exclusion process where there's a greater receptivity to the concerns of businesses and workers. It seems like the exclusion process that has been pursued by USTR to date has been very biased towards not lifting and not providing sanctions, exclusions, and not really listening to valid concerns. With respect to these so-called phase 2 issues, which includes issues that were partially addressed in phase 1, like IPR and tech transfer, and the phase 2 issues, including cyber, subsidies, and state-owned enterprises, I just don't see the Biden administration hopping into a bilateral negotiation with China on all of these issues. I think that, at least what I would recommend if I were part of the team, would be, let's look at each issue individually, figure out the most effective way to address it, figure out who our allies and partners are on these issues, and also determine whether a multilateral solution makes more sense, particularly in the area of subsidies, and if so, give the WTO a chance to work on this. So I would argue for kind of a more, a detailed approach with respect to all these different issues versus bundling them all up and trying to bring them to the table bilaterally and work with China on them. I don't see that leading to success anytime soon. And just to switch gears for a minute here, your questions on RCEP and TPP. I mean, one concern I have is that China is moving pretty quickly on the trade front, in the trade and investment front in the world. And we've seen just in the past few months, they were one of the key signatories to the RCEP agreement. At the end of the year, they just concluded an investment deal with Europe. They're talking about revamping the trilateral negotiations with Japan and Korea, and even possibly entering CPTPP as an accession partner. And so China, again, it's not standing still, and neither are the other countries in Asia, frankly, either. And the Biden administration right now, and rightfully so, is focusing on domestic issues, but also talking about it needs time to review all these policies and develop its own strategies for going forward. So what I'm concerned about is that there'll be a real gap there, and that when we're ready to re-engage, the world's going to even move on even further away from us than it is now. And that's one of the reasons why I've been advocating that the United States should think about doing limited, narrow sectoral agreements in the region. And I think the areas of digital, medical, supply chains, and climate and trade are three areas just kind of ripe for such an approach, and engage countries in the region on those issues. And then take your time about figuring out if and when you would want to return to a TPP-like agreement. And my final point would be, if we were ever to return to TPP or CPTPP as it's called now, let's be honest, we would need to seek major revisions and updates. And while other countries, I think, want us back in, and they'll have some bandwidth for accepting some changes, I think the United States would need to be very judicious about the changes that they would be seeking to that agreement. And that may just be a bridge too far that can't be cracked. But from my vantage point, I would hope that we would look at that approach again, working with like-minded countries on a whole slew of issues going forward.
Thank you for that. Well, Bob, looking forward, Biden administration, macro, FX, CFIUS, financial sanctions. China's opening to U.S. financial firms recently a little bit, but there's U.S. proposals to restrict Chinese capital market access to the U.S. And then there's the Chinese overseas lending, a full plate. Any thoughts?
Sure. First is the character of Treasury's interaction with China has changed. It's less macroeconomic, less financial services now, and it's shifted more towards administration of the CFIUS process and also administration of financial sanctions. I think the one clear exception in macro is the looming international debt distress and debt default issues countries have borrowed after COVID. That'll involve some hard negotiations, but I think that will work out. On financial services, ironically, the Chinese waited too long to open up their financial sector, and they aren't getting any credit for it. It's just not what the administration cares about. It's not an issue that affects ordinary Americans. And I think it was Jake Sullivan who said recently that it would not be a particular priority of the Biden administration. The CFIUS investment review process has expanded to include venture capital funding, to include collection of personal data, transfer of technology to joint ventures, and is also, I think, going to become more important internationally as the United States works with other countries to strengthen their investment screening process. Financial sanctions is an area where there's just been an inexorable increase in the scope and the extent of financial sanctions. Originally, they were terrorist finance and money laundering, but they've expanded to include human rights issues and also general countering of U.S. adversaries. They've also begun to lean in towards secondary sanctions, where you sanction a foreign entity, including possibly a bank, because it deals with a directly sanctioned entity. Sanctioning a major Chinese bank, cutting it off from the US financial system, would be a huge step and a potentially financially destabilizing step. One I think the Yellen Treasury will weigh in heavily on. In the area of investments, I think there are going to be a number of restrictions on US investments in China. Some of them will be symbolic and won't matter a great deal. But the thing I would particularly watch is what the Biden administration does with a Department of Defense list of companies that are linked to the Chinese military and are therefore banned for investment by US agents, individuals, and firms. That's a big deal. The other thing that I would watch carefully, an agency not represented here, but one that's going to be very important in the Biden administration, is the Commerce Department. Commerce has issued interim final rules on a CFIUS-like process for examining transactions in ICT, services, products, maintenance, software updates, that is potentially extremely wide in its scope and could do a great deal to to harm U.S. interest, U.S. companies, disrupt supply chains, and do a considerable amount of damage. In addition, Commerce Department also has to come out with definitions of foundational technologies and emerging technologies. And when they do that, it will strengthen both export controls and also the administration of the CFIUS process. So that's a space to definitely watch.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe we're getting quite a few questions in, so why don't we do a quick round that I mentioned on process issues. There's questions about how do we engage China, and then there's questions about the U.S. process itself. Kurt, what does it mean? What are your thoughts? But what does it mean for somebody like Kurt Campbell to coordinate a U.S. approach to China? I'm a good diehard Treasury guy. I was told pretty much the first day and I joined the Treasury that coordination is what you do to the other guy. So, is Janet Yellen going to listen to Kurt Campbell on R&B policy, and is the Secretary of Defense going to do what Kurt tells him to do in the South China Sea? And I know you're a good friend of Kurt, so I hope you don't mind this intemperate question.
That's a great question, and thank you for being so honest about Treasury's approach to interagency coordination.
I'm sure it shocks you.
Some of us figured that out early on.
True. But it illustrates the point. I don't think that Secretary Yellen or Secretary Austin necessarily going to listen to Kurt Campbell. I do think they're going to listen to Joe Biden. My understanding is that the president himself is actively engaged in a range of foreign policy issues, even amid the COVID situation. And there's an enormous advantage to that 35 years of congressional experience that President Trump used to make fun of in Biden's ability to kind of come to terms with these issues quickly and give direction. And so I think, I'm hopeful that given the fact that everyone understands that this is serious business and that China is a significant challenge, that there will be sincere effort to try and figure out what exactly to do, with an emphasis on what works, as opposed to what traditional policy has been at the agency level. So I'm not as worried about internal coordination as I am about external coordination, because most of the strategies that we've been discussing today require coalitions of the willing among the United States and other key countries in order to be truly effective, whether you're talking about trade policy approaches, technology controls, the military stuff, even in finance. What about digital currencies? All of these issues coming that are both arising and already here, building those like-minded points of view among the countries that matter, particularly given that issue by issue, it's a different set of countries, right? So I heard the other day that someone suggests the idea that the Quad should be talking about export controls. Well, no, the Quad should not be talking about export controls because that's not the right not the right group of countries. And in fact, even technology by technology, you probably want to have a different set of countries involved. So doing that external coordination with real feedback loops and frankly a sense of humility, because participated in a couple of Wendy's seminars where it became quite apparent that the Europeans are a little bit fed up with us, right? And the Asians don't show it as clearly, but many of them are kind of a little bit perturbed with the United States. So we're going to have to be working with them as we make policy, and that is going to be tricky. And then the last part will be China's going to be in there on every particular opportunity trying to make sure that that coordination doesn't take place, throw up chaff, kind of create discord among people that are focused on these issues. One of the good ways to deal with that is the other element, which is necessary. So I think, Wendy lowered expectations about bilateral negotiation, but I still think it's important for each person in the US government to have on speed dial and in regular conversation with a Chinese counterpart, talking through these issues and at least, explaining back and forth what's going on and what the points of view are. That's an important source of information gathering and creates stabilization. And doing that without the expectation that it's going to necessarily result in something. So I think that it's important, like when our cabinet secretaries, we all get on airplanes again eventually, they fly to Beijing, or someone comes from Beijing, that people aren't asking them, so what did you get? What did China agree to do? Because they're not going to agree to do anything, right? And so let's just say that it's just communication, and it's more sort of what do we agree to with our friends and allies that's important.
Thank you. Wendy, tell us about what worked and didn't work with the Chinese from the USTR perspective, and any thoughts on how the new USTR will approach China. And, I recall USTR dealt a lot with MOFCOM, but MOFCOM works for others. So how does that all shake out?
Well, again, when you look at the role USTR and Ambassador Lighthizer in particular played over the past 4 years in China policy, I don't think that's going to be repeated. I think, that was a time where Trump liked those trade issues. He felt comfortable with them. And Lighthizer was just brilliant in being able to explain them and to the president, and yet pursue what he wanted to pursue with the Chinese, where he wasn't really into the purchasing targets, from what I understand. He cared a lot more about the structural reforms, but he also recognized who he worked for. But the other point is, and this is something that Kurt raised, when you think about it and you look at, by the end of the Trump administration, the communication between Chinese officials and US officials, basically non-existent, except for the channel between, Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Mnuchin to some degree, and Liu He. And I think that's because they negotiated together and they had a shared interest in implementing this agreement. And so I kind of agree with what Kurt was saying, that I think that communication was lacking. We need that. It doesn't mean you're going to be best friends with someone, but you need to be able to pick up the phone, particularly with in a bilateral relationship that's as complex and consequential as the US-China relationship, and to have discussions with your Chinese counterparts. Now, I don't think we need, and we should resume those big dialogues we had with lots of Chinese and US officials all in one room. But I wouldn't rule out that on specific issues, even if you're not negotiating, some kind of dialogues where you're bringing in the key agencies from both sides could play a role. But I think the Biden team should give careful thought to how they would structure any dialogue going forward. I mean, I'm very concerned when I talk to Chinese counterparts in the think tank world and former officials. It seems they're all saying we just need to get the dialogues back. If we got the dialogues back, then that could put our relationship back on track. And, you know, the more they say it, the more I'm convinced we don't need dialogues, because I think what the dialogues did, to a large extent, they kind of, they weren't action oriented towards the end, in my view, and they allowed a lot of talk without really focusing on the key issues and delivering outcomes that mattered. Then just briefly on internal coordination, I mean, I agree with Kurt. Look, there's going to be fits and starts. There's going to be some bumps in the road. There are a lot of really smart people coming into the administration coming into it. I think, you know, when it comes to China, a lot of them already been grilled by Congress or will be grilled on their views. And so I think, you know, they'll share a lot of views and they'll be following the lead of the president. But as someone who worked for the government for many, many years, I think there will be some bumps, but I'm hopeful that, you know, under the leadership of the president and Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, that all these different views, once again, can be brought together internally, differences ironed out quietly, and then presenting a unified front to China. My final comment would be, it's the coordination with the allies and partners, which is also going to be critical. And there, I would just say, we need to not only have humility, that's what Kurt said, I couldn't agree more. We need to be in a listening mode too, and not a lecturing mode. And we need to kind of have our expectations in check. In certain areas, our interests will align. In other areas, they won't. In certain areas, even where we share the same concerns, the level of ambition will be different. The venues where folks feel comfortable pursuing these issues will differ. And so that the work with allies and partners is going to be not only critical, it's going to be difficult. But in my view, we have like an incredible team that has been appointed who can lead these talks and already have established relationships with so many important people around the world.
Well, thank you for that. Those were very wise words. I think I agreed with everything you said. Bob, very briefly, before we turn to audience questions, which are piling up for Kurt and Wendy. So far, you're off the hook. Do you have any further comments?
Sure, just a couple of quick things. Each administration gets to define its own China dialogue, China interaction. But the Biden administration will not have an SED or SED-like dialogue. It just requires a cordiality and optimism that simply doesn't exist today. I agree with Wendy and Kurt. I think the dialogues are going to be more specific, more individual interest or issue-oriented, probably more technical, which plays into the kind of things that Treasury, particularly the Fed, does. I think I agree with Wendy that, you know, Congress is looking very carefully at any sign of wavering by Biden appointees or Biden staff members. The same is going on within the Chinese government. I think, you know, the work with America wing has been greatly weakened. I also want to echo the point about the withering of contacts between the U.S. administrations and the Chinese administration. For all its faults, the SED and the SED build up an extensive web of contacts from the non-cabinet political appointees on down, that you were able to call people up and you know, consult or inform if you needed to. We simply don't have that today. And that's going to be a real issue if there is a crisis that requires U.S.-China cooperation on a very short time fuse.
Well, thank you. Let's turn to audience questions. Kurt is popular. There's two sets of questions coming in. One about will the Biden administration distinguish between its response to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan? Can Europe, sorry, can China have confidence that whatever is negotiated will continue into the next administration? There's there's that set, and then there's just questions about how will the U.S. deal with China in third country areas such as Central Asia or Russia.
Okay, well, that's a bit, but well, I think it's important to distinguish between the Taiwan issue and the others that were mentioned, specifically Xinjiang and Hong Kong. In both of those cases, the United States is very unhappy with Chinese policy, and it represents a policy change on the part of China to aggressively try to weaken the cultural identity of the Uyghur people on the one hand, and in Hong Kong eliminate political opposition and open political debate. The U.S. has extraordinarily limited leverage on either of those issues, and I think the main focus of activity will be to call out what China's doing, and in the fact in Xinjiang it's violating international norms. In Hong Kong, it's breaking its promises, and that's kind of the whole story there. Taiwan is a more complicated set of issues involving military cooperation and coordination, a diplomatic dance around the One China policy, and maintaining some leverage for Taiwan in the international space. So I think there's a distinction there that will be recognized and followed. The last thing on that perhaps is that Hong Kong is both properly and improperly viewed as kind of a frontline issue with respect to Taiwan. I think that the steps that China has taken in Hong Kong have actually hurt its standing in Taiwan to a very significant extent. but the policy options and the kind of things that the United States and other countries should do with respect to Taiwan are very different than they are with respect to Hong Kong. Can China think that an agreement reached with this administration would carry on to the next one? Only if it's a good deal for the United States. So if China, if they have some crafty plan to hoodwink the U.S. into a not so good agreement, then it's quite possible they could be thrown out by the next administration. By the same token, if you have an agreement that has some teeth to it, I don't hear anyone in the Biden administration saying that the U.S. should throw out the structural elements of the Phase 1 agreement, trade agreement that was reached. There was some progress there, and that will be pocketed and move forward. In third country cooperation coordination, very complex topic, but I would say that, and you mentioned Central Asia, the goal for the U.S. and other like-minded nations should be to make sure that the nations that are being showered with particular attention from China realize that they have and actually have options for market-based, transparent development policy transactions and support, so that they're not trapped into exclusive relationships with China. And that's something that those countries want, obviously, with a very few exceptions. And that's something that should be achievable, rather than trying to view the objective as preventing Chinese influence in those nations, but rather presenting those nations with options. I think that's the better way to frame it, because it's an impossible task to prevent the world's largest economy and purchasing power parity from having any influence on the global stage, particularly economically. That's not going to take place. But by presenting nations with options, then that can temper the types of deals that China's making in these countries.
Thanks. You have 30 seconds on Russia and China and the U.S.
I have heard this idea that the U.S. should play a Russia card on China. I'm not feeling it. I'm not, don't consider myself a Russia expert, but I haven't seen any trustworthy behavior by Vladimir Putin since he was in his early days in the KGB. So I'm not feeling that as a strategy. I get the theoretical underpinnings of it, but not sure that's going to work.
Hey, Wendy, is China serious about wanting to get into CPTPP, and can it meet the standards? There's also a question for you about finding a solution on steel overcapacity, and if that's unlikely, what does it mean for 232s? And if you have any thoughts on climate and how that might affect US-China trade and cutting emissions. Simple questions.
Okay, so with respect to CPTPP, it is true that Xi Jinping has now said that he is considering CPTPP. And the question is that serious? When you look at the text of CPTPP, which largely remained intact even once the US left, China would have enormous challenges based on its trade and investment regime today in adhering to the rules commitments. Everyone, right away points to the state-owned enterprise rules, but I would argue that's just part of the puzzle. I mean, you have rules on labor, on environment, on IPR protection that will, and digital trade that will present enormous challenges for China if it were to sign up to, or at least express interest and start accession negotiations. So I'm pretty skeptical of Chinese interest. I think, it's a no-lose kind of talking point for the Chinese leadership because they are trying to kind of show the world that they're the true multilateralist, that, it's the United States that has acted unilaterally and now is talking about, working with small circles of democracy. But China is ready to work with others and, be part of a rules-based trading system. So I'm pretty skeptical that this is going to happen anytime soon. What I am watching, though, if they do formally express interest, how the other CPTPP countries respond, because I think there will be pressure on them to be, to keep the door open and to welcome them into the accession process. So we need to watch that carefully. And I think that that will require some very skillful diplomacy and maneuvering by a number of countries. Your second question dealing with steel and 232. Look, I mean, a lot of people were hoping that the Biden administration would come in and would lift these steel and aluminum tariffs right away. That is not going to happen either. They're going to be reviewing all of these tariffs. And particularly when it comes to the steel and aluminum tariffs, I think we need to keep in mind that there will be domestic political pressures to keep them in place. So then what do you do? And what I would argue is if you want to lift them, you need to show the world and your domestic stakeholders what you're doing to really get at the core problem of steel and aluminum. That is Chinese global overcapacity. We tried to deal with this multilaterally in the OECD. It did not work. So that, in my view, the Biden administration is going to have to figure out how to put together a multilateral coalition to deal with this problem. And then if they can show that and show other countries are serious with respect to taking measures to prevent circumvention of steel restrictions in the United States, I think there could be a package that could pave the way for the US lifting its 232 aluminum and steel tariffs.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Bob is off the hook on answering questions from the audience, which is always a good place to be, I think. But I want to
actually, Mark, could I say one thing?
Absolutely.
I was shocked by what you said about interagency coordination. When I joined Treasury, I was told to do everything I could to help my colleagues in other agencies, although I might not have heard that quite properly. The The other thing I'll mention is I think Wendy's right about TPP in China. I think it's a no-cost strategy to express interest by the Chinese. I think it's also a reasonably good strategy to keep the United States out. I think, the belief that China was a TPP member was part of the reason why many in the United States were opposed to the agreement. And I think having a trading group that China is a member just makes it impossible for the United States to join.
Well, thank you. You have the last word. I thank Bob, Wendy, Kurt for joining me today. It was extremely kind of you to share your precious time with us. Thank you for your wonderful answers and insights. Thank you.